My name is Claire Beaumont, and the worst moment of my life didn't happen in a hospital ward, or in the middle of a 12-hour shift, or even during the worst weeks of 2021, when I watched 3 patients die in a single night. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. Standing on the front porch of my childhood home in Oakville, Ontario, still wearing the creases from a 6-hour drive, when my brother looked at me and said the one word that undid everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I had been a registered nurse for 9 years. 6 of those years I spent in critical care at a hospital in Vancouver, which meant I had chosen, deliberately and knowingly, to build my life 3,000 kilometers from the family I grew up with. People always assume that distance is a form of abandonment. They never ask what you were running toward. My father understood. He was a quiet man, Francois Beaumont, the kind of man who communicated through doing rather than saying. He had opened a small watch repair shop on Kerr Street in Oakville the year I was born, a narrow storefront wedged between a dry cleaner and a Vietnamese bakery, the kind of place that smelled like machine oil and old wood and the faint sweetness of solder. He worked alone mostly. He had inherited the craft from his own father, and he wore it the way he wore everything, without ceremony, without complaint. My brother Dominic was 3 years older than me, which meant he had always been there first. First to drive, first to graduate, first to stay. He had never left Oakville. He had a contracting business, a house 20 minutes from our parents, and a talent for making his proximity feel like virtue. When my mother died in 2018, Dominic was the one who handled the arrangements. I flew in, stayed a week, flew back. The guilt of that followed me for months. But I was mid-probation at the hospital, deep in a staffing crisis that predated the pandemic by 2 years, and the nursing union in BC was already stretched past breaking. Leaving wasn't a simple thing. It never was. My father and I talked on the phone every Sunday evening. He asked careful questions about my patients without asking their names. He wanted to know if I was sleeping, if I was eating, if I had found a good bakery near my apartment. He never once said I should come home more often. That was his way of saying he understood. When COVID hit, everything changed in a way that is difficult to explain to someone who wasn't inside it. The ICU became a place that existed outside of ordinary time. Shifts dissolved into each other. I wore the same 3 pairs of scrubs on rotation because laundry felt impossible. I called my father less. When I did call, I kept it short, because the things I would have needed to say, to be honest, were not things I wanted him to carry. I didn't go home for Christmas in 2020 or 2021. I was terrified of carrying something back to him. He was 73, with 1 functioning kidney and a history of respiratory infections that made every cough in his direction feel like a threat I was personally responsible for managing. Dominic called once, sometime in January 2021, to tell me that Dad seemed lonely. I said I knew, and I was sorry, and there was nothing I could do about it right then. Dominic said fine, and hung up, and something in the silence before the call ended told me that he was filing that moment away somewhere. My father had a small stroke in February 2022. Minor, the doctors said, but enough. He could no longer manage the fine motor precision that watch repair required. He kept the shop open for another 4 months out of stubbornness, then quietly closed the door one Thursday and didn't reopen it. Dominic told me about the closure in a text message. 3 sentences. He didn't mention that Dad had cried. I found that out later, from Mrs. Tremblay next door, who had watched my father stand on the sidewalk in front of the locked shop for 20 minutes before getting in his car. My father died on a Wednesday in August 2023. Aneurysm. Sudden. No warning. He was 75. I got the call from Dominic at 5:40 inches the morning Pacific time, and I booked a flight before 6. I was in Oakville by that evening. Dominic met me at the door. He looked the same, heavier maybe, the kind of tired that comes from carrying things other people don't see. He held the door open, said come in, offered me coffee. We sat at the kitchen table of the house we had grown up in, which now felt like a stage set for a life that had already ended. And then, after 40 minutes of logistics funeral home, obituary, who to call, he slid a folder across the table. Dad's will, he said. Lawyer already went through it with me. I opened it, read it carefully, the way nurses learn to read anything clinical, looking for the detail that changes everything. The house went to Dominic. The car, the contents of the savings account, a small RRSP, all Dominic. To me, my father had left the watch shop. The building itself, which he owned outright, and everything inside it. I looked up. Dominic met my eyes. His expression was neutral, but there was something underneath it, not guilt, something closer to satisfaction. "He planned this for a while," Dominic said. "I helped him update the will last spring. You were there when he updated it. He needed someone to take him to the lawyer. You weren't here." I had just lost my father. I want to be clear about what that means when it happens, because grief is not a clean thing. It doesn't arrive in stages the way the textbooks suggest. It arrives like weather, suddenly and everywhere. But underneath it, that morning, I felt something else forming. Something quiet and specific and patient. I asked to see the shop the next morning. Dominic drove me, parked outside, handed me the keys like he was returning borrowed items. "I'll be at Mum's for lunch if you need anything," he said, and left. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at the sign, Beaumont Horlogerie, the letters faded but still legible, the hand-painted clock face my father had added in the 1990s still visible under years of weather. I unlocked the door. The smell hit me first. Machine oil, old wood, solder, him. I stood in the entrance and didn't move for a full minute. The shop was exactly as I remembered it and also somehow smaller. The long wooden counter with its glass display case, the shelves of tools arranged with the obsessive precision of a man who believed order was a form of respect. Clocks covered every wall, dozens of them, stopped now, silent in a way that felt too pointed to be accidental. My father would have hated the silence. I walked slowly through the front room into the workshop behind. His jeweler's loupe sat beside an unfinished pocket watch on the bench, a cup of pens. A notepad with handwriting I recognized so immediately it made my chest ache. I sat down at his bench and allowed myself 5 minutes. That was all I had capacity for. 5 minutes of sitting in the place that smelled like him, with his tools within arm's reach, before I had to become functional again. It was during those 5 minutes that I noticed the floor. I wasn't looking for anything. I was just sitting, eyes unfocused, letting the grief be present without fighting it. But something caught my attention near the back wall, behind the standing shelves. The floor was uneven. Not dramatically, not visibly from the doorway. But from the bench, at that angle, I could see that a section of the old hardwood near the baseboard had a slightly different grain pattern, slightly different wear. I crouched, ran my fingers along the edge, felt a seam where there shouldn't be one. It took me several minutes to move the shelves aside. They were heavy, dense with binders and equipment cases and small wooden drawers of parts. When I had cleared enough space, I could see it clearly. A panel, roughly 60 by 80 centimeters, set flush into the floor. A recessed pull handle, blackened with age. I sat back on my heels and looked at it for a moment. My father was not a dramatic man. He did not do things for effect. Whatever was under this floor was there because it served a purpose he had thought carefully about. I pulled the handle. The panel lifted on old hinges, soundlessly, which told me it had been maintained. The space below was dry, climate-controlled somehow. A small dehumidifier unit visible in the corner below, its indicator light long dark. Metal shelving, the same obsessive organization as the shop above. Binders, boxes, archival cases. I descended the short wooden steps. The first thing I understood was that my father had been careful about this for a very long time. The binders were labeled by year, going back to 1987. Business records, yes, but also property documents, insurance policies, correspondence. At the center shelf, a fireproof lockbox sat apart from the rest, the kind you could buy at Canadian Tire but wouldn't unless you had something worth protecting. My name was written on a piece of tape across the front, Claire. My hands were not steady when I opened it. Inside, a sealed envelope, a leather portfolio, a set of documents held together with a binder clip, and a smaller envelope labeled Open Second. I opened the sealed one first. My father's handwriting. Careful, unhurried, the same hand that had addressed birthday cards to me for 30 years. Claire, if you're reading this, then you went to the shop. I knew you would. You've always been the one who goes toward difficult things rather than away from them. I owe you honesty I should have offered while I was still able to. The shop was never my consolation prize for you. It is the thing I valued most, and I am leaving it to you because I believe you are the only one of my children who understands what it means to do careful work for its own sake, without an audience. I love your brother, but I know what he values. I know what you value. The documents in the portfolio will explain the rest. Read them slowly. Take your time. You're good at that. I set the letter down. The portfolio held the deed to the building, which I already knew about. But behind it, a second property document, dated 1999. A storage unit facility on the edge of town, 8 units, owned outright by my father through a numbered company I had never heard of. Below that, correspondence with a patent office. Correspondence with a horological society in Switzerland. A valuation document, dated 2019, for the collection of timepieces in the display cases in the back shelves. The number at the bottom of the page made me sit down on the concrete floor. My father had spent 50 years quietly assembling one of the most significant private collections of Canadian and European antique horology in Ontario. He had never mentioned it, not once. He had continued to charge $12 to replace watch batteries while sitting 5 meters away from pieces worth more than most people's houses. The smaller envelope, the one marked open second, contained a handwritten note from a woman named Margaret Osei, a certified appraiser with the Canadian Antique Dealers Association. The note was 3 years old. "Your father asked me to hold this letter until he passed," she had written. "He was very specific. He said one of his children would come to the shop before any decisions were made about its future. He hoped it would be you." He hoped. I sat in that basement for a long time, long enough for the autumn light to shift and the cold of the floor to work its way through my jeans. I read every document. I took photos with my phone. I thought about my father standing on the sidewalk outside the locked door, and about the Sunday phone calls, and about the way he had always asked if I was eating enough, if I had found a good bakery, if I was sleeping. He had known exactly what he was doing. I didn't say anything to Dominic that week, or the next. The funeral came and went. People told me my father was a good man, which he was, and that I must be proud, which I was, and that it was such a shame I had been so far away, which I absorbed without response because grief makes people say things they believe are comforting. Dominic managed the reception with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this role for years. He greeted guests, directed the catering, accepted condolences with the practiced grace of a man at the center of a story. I stood to the side and watched and said nothing. 2 weeks after the funeral, I called a lawyer. Her name was Patricia Anand, estate and property law, with offices in Mississauga. She was thorough, quiet, and had the particular gift of making complex things clear without oversimplifying them. I laid out what I had found. She read the documents carefully. "This is a significant estate," she said finally. "I know." She removed her glasses. "The numbered company holding the storage facility your father established it in 1998. The annual income from that property would have been modest but consistent." She paused. "Are you aware of the full contents of those units?" "No." She showed me the inventory from a document I hadn't noticed in the portfolio, tucked behind the valuation. 8 storage units, all registered to the numbered company. Contents varied, but one unit in particular she slid the page toward me had been inventoried separately and recently. I read the list. Tools, primarily. Specialized horological equipment, and a collection of correspondence, business records, and workshop notes spanning 50 years. "Handbooks," she said. "Journals. Techniques your father developed independently for restoring particular movement types." She paused again. "I'm going to suggest you speak with someone at the Ontario Craft Council before we go any further." 14 days later, a specialist named David LaRoche met me at the shop. He was in his 60s, soft-spoken, the kind of man who crouched to look at things rather than picking them up. He spent 3 hours in the shop in the basement. He did not speak much while he worked. When he came upstairs, he sat across from me at the counter and was quiet for a moment. "Your father documented restoration techniques for movement types that most working horologists in Canada have never handled," he said. "Some of this work," he gestured toward the stack of journals, "has applications we've been trying to reconstruct from incomplete records for 20 years. I held his gaze. He cleared his throat. "There are institutions that would be interested in acquiring access to this. Not the pieces themselves, necessarily. The knowledge." He paused. "Your father understood what he had. This wasn't an accident." "No," I said. "It wasn't." Dominic came to the shop on a Thursday, unannounced. He had a key I hadn't thought to change the lock yet, and I noted this as an oversight I would correct before the end of the day. He walked in, looked around, looked at me behind the counter. "You're spending a lot of time here," he said. "I'm going through everything." He picked up a clock from the shelf, turned it over, set it down. I was thinking we should talk about the property. The shop? All of it. He looked at me carefully. Dad didn't have a lot of liquid assets. I've got carrying costs on the house, the property taxes, the estate fees. It would make more sense if we pooled resources and sold this building. Split the proceeds. I leaned back slightly. The building wasn't left to you. We're family, Claire. His voice was even. You're going to go back to Vancouver. You're not going to run a watch shop. I might not go back to Vancouver. A pause. He hadn't expected that. Don't be sentimental. He gestured around, this isn't a real plan. I kept my voice level. I'm not being sentimental. You have a career. You have a life out there. He stepped closer. Look, I know you're still processing everything, I get it, but realistically, what are you going to do with this? I'm going to figure that out, I said. His expression shifted. Something came through, not quite anger, more like a reset, like he was switching approaches. You know, it wasn't easy being the one who stayed. He looked at me with something careful in his eyes. I was the one who took Dad to his appointments. I was the one who closed the shop with him, who sat with him when he couldn't do the work anymore. I did all of that while you were out there building your life. The words were designed to land somewhere soft, and they almost did. I know you were here, I said quietly. Then you know this isn't fair. I held his gaze for a long moment. Dad thought it was. He left without saying anything else. I watched his truck back out of the small parking space and pull into traffic, and then I picked up my phone and sent Patricia Anand a message, confirming that I wanted to proceed. The Oakville Heritage and Craft Fair was held every year in early December, in the large hall of the Oakville Conference Center. It had been running for 31 years, and my father had exhibited there exactly once, in 2003, which I knew because there was a photograph of him at his table tucked into the second binder in the basement. He was younger in it. He was smiling at something outside the frame. This year, Dominic's contracting company was one of the event's corporate sponsors. His logo was on the banner outside. He had a table near the entrance. I saw it when I arrived. I had arranged my own table through Patricia's office, under the numbered company name, which had the advantage of being unremarkable. 3 of the antique pieces were on display, conservatively valued, conservatively presented. Margaret Osei stood to my right, available to speak with any interested parties. David LaRoche was across the room, speaking with representatives from the Royal Ontario Museum, who had reached out after he'd made a few calls. I had dressed simply. Dark wool, practical boots, nothing that signaled anything in particular. I was there to work. Dominic noticed me 40 minutes into the event. He was making his way through the room with the unhurried confidence of a sponsor, nodding at people, shaking hands. Then he stopped. He looked at the table, at Margaret, at the display, at me. He crossed the room. "What is this?" he said low. "A table." His eyes moved to the pieces. "What are those? From the shop?" His jaw tightened. "You can't just, these are part of the estate. They belong to me," I said calmly. "As assessed, appraised, and documented." He stepped closer. "You've been doing this whole time, behind my back. I've been protecting what Dad left me. You have no idea what any of this is worth." "I do, actually." His voice dropped further. "You are not doing this here." "I'm not doing anything," I said. "I'm standing at my table." He looked around quickly. Several people nearby had registered the tension. A woman in a blue blazer from the Canadian antique dealer's table was watching with polite attentiveness. A board member from the Craft Council had turned slightly toward us. "This is not the time," Dominic said. "You once told me I was never here when the family needed me. I kept my voice even. I kept it low. I understand why you feel that way, but I was working. I was working in a hospital during a pandemic, trying not to bring something home to Dad. That wasn't absence. That was the most present I knew how to be." His face changed. Something underneath the composure began to show. "You let me carry everything," he said. "I know. You weren't there." Tears tightened his voice in a way I hadn't heard since we were children. "I did everything. And he stopped. The room was not silent, but the space immediately around us had gone still. People nearby were pretending not to listen, which is a particular Canadian politeness I have always found quietly decent. "He still left this to me," I said gently. "Not because he loved you less." I stepped closer slightly, lowering my voice further. "Because he knew what you valued. He knew what I valued. That's in the letter he wrote me. He wasn't punishing you. He was being precise." Dominic looked at the floor. Patricia Anand arrived at my side at that moment with a quiet professionalism I was grateful for. "Mr. Beaumont," she said, "whenever you're ready, there are some documents we should walk through. Nothing adversarial, just clarity." He looked at her, then at me. There was a long pause. He walked away from the table, not out of the building, just away, to a quieter corner of the hall, and Patricia followed, and the ordinary noise of the event gradually resumed around me. I stood at the table and breathed. The specialist from the ROM came over 20 minutes later. We talked for a long time about restoration technique, about archival access, about what a formal partnership might look like. Margaret fielded questions from 3 collectors who had come specifically because of a quiet mention in the Craft Council's newsletter. By the time the event ended, I had 3 letters of intent and a proposed agreement with the ROM that would, if completed, give their conservation department access to my father's technique journals in exchange for a formal donation receipt and an endowed fund in his name. Not his money, his knowledge, his life's work, properly placed. Dominic came to the shop a week later. He knocked this time, which he hadn't done before. I unlocked the door and let him in. He looked tired. The kind of tired I recognized from the mirror in my second year of ICU nursing, when I had realized that the hardest part of the work was not the technical skill but the sustained presence. Being somewhere difficult, day after day, without the option of stepping back, I made tea. We sat at the counter, the way we had sat at the kitchen table as children, doing homework while Dad moved quietly through the shop around us. He wrapped his hands around the mug. "I didn't know about any of this," he said. "About the collection? About any of it." He paused. "I didn't know he'd written you a letter." "He wrote it a long time before he died." Dominic nodded slowly. "He never told me things directly. He just did them and expected you to figure out the intention." "Yes. That drove me insane when we were kids." "Me too," I said. A small silence. Not hostile. Just air between 2 people who had been in the same family their whole lives and still sometimes struggled to speak the same language. "I wasn't trying to take anything from you," he said finally. "I thought I was protecting what was left." I thought he stopped. "I thought that's what he would have wanted." "He wanted us to figure it out," I said. "By leaving you everything useful, and me the house." Dominic's voice was dry, but something in it had softened. "He left you the house because he knew you'd keep it," I said. "He knew I might not." Dominic looked at the stopped clocks on the wall. They were still silent. I had been meaning to wind them, but I hadn't yet. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Of course. Why didn't you come home more? During the pandemic? Even once?" I looked at my hands around my mug, because I was genuinely afraid of what I might carry back. He was 73 with 1 kidney. "Every month I thought about coming back and talked myself out of it for the same reason," I said. "It wasn't indifference. It was the opposite." He was quiet for a while. "He talked about you every time I saw him," he said. "He'd mentioned something you'd told him on the phone, how your ward was managing. Some patient you'd described without breaking confidentiality. He knew you were staying away on purpose. He knew why." "Did he say that?" "Not in those words." Dominic almost smiled. He never used those words, but he knew. The first clock on the wall, a brass bracket clock with a broken mainspring, began to move. Just the pendulum at first, tentatively, then steadying into its rhythm. I had wound it that morning without really noticing. We both looked at it. It turned out the storage units held more than equipment. In the 3rd unit, behind a row of archival cases, there was a box of correspondence that had nothing to do with horology. Letters, cards, photographs. Some from me, sent over 15 years, kept in precise chronological order. Birthday cards. A postcard from Tofino I had sent on a whim in 2017. A note I had written on prescription pad paper during a night shift, rambling and tired, telling him about a patient who had reminded me of him. He had kept all of it. In a separate envelope near the bottom, a note in his handwriting, undated. "She thinks she is far away. She has never been far." I stood in that storage unit for a long time, holding a box of proof that I had not been forgotten or discounted. That the distance I had always feared would define me had been understood by the one person who mattered most to understand it. The ROM agreement was finalized in February. The collection appraised at a figure that would take some time to fully absorb. Patricia structured the estate in a way that was equitable, not equal, a distinction she made carefully, and I appreciated. Dominic received a proper accounting of assets tied to the house, and a percentage of the storage unit income. we both received something more functional than what we'd started with. The shop reopened in March, not as Beaumont Horlogerie precisely, but as a workshop and education space operating under the numbered company's umbrella. 2 days a week, I ran drop-in sessions for people learning basic watch maintenance. One afternoon a month, David LaRoche brought a small group of students from the Craft Council. The work was unhurried, precise, done for its own sake. I did not go back to Vancouver. I found a small apartment 7 minutes from the shop. I signed a 6-month contract with a hospital in Burlington, ICU, so I was still doing the work I'd trained for, still showing up to the hard rooms, still being the kind of present I knew how to be. On the first warm evening in April, I sat outside the shop after closing. The Kerr Street sidewalk was quiet, the dry cleaner next door already dark, the Vietnamese bakery just closing, the smell of something sweet still drifting out as the owner locked up and waved. The old sign above me moved faintly in the wind, the painted clock face my father had added the year before I was born. I thought about distance, and what it looks like from the outside, and how rarely it reflects the truth of what it costs. My father had understood something I was only beginning to fully absorb, that showing up in the ways no one sees is still showing up, that staying away to protect someone is still staying. That the work you do quietly, without applause, without an audience, is sometimes the most significant thing you will ever do. He had left me a watch shop. He had left me everything he believed I could carry. And for the first time since I had come home, sitting in the cool April air on a quiet street in the town I had grown up in, I felt the particular peace of someone who has finally, fully, arrived. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone you love, or something you carried alone for too long, share it. Leave a comment. And if you want to hear more stories about the quiet ways people hold each other up, even across distance, even across silence, subscribe to Still Bearing. We'll be here.